My cousin laughed, looking me up and down as he wiped beer off the table. "Can you even fight, or did you just answer phones in the army?" he teased. I smiled calmly and said, "Only hand to hand. Knives were optional." He scoffed, looking at the rest of my family for approval. "Let me guess, they called you princess." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Hades." Across the patio, a retired Navy SEAL dropped his bourbon glass. It shattered instantly because he knew exactly who I was. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. My name is Zariah. I am 32 years old, and my family thinks I am a glorified delivery dispatcher who washed out of the military. I let them believe that because it keeps them out of my real business. But that carefully crafted illusion began to shatter during our annual Juneteenth barbecue at my parents' sprawling estate in Atlanta. The humid summer air was thick with the smell of smoked ribs, sweet barbecue sauce, and the sound of classic rhythm and blues pulsing from the outdoor speakers. To the outside world, my family, the Washingtons, represented the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. My father, Calvin, and my mother, Loretta, were obsessed with image status and impressing the right people in their affluent neighborhood. They curated every aspect of our lives to project flawless success. But underneath that shiny veneer, the family dynamic was a toxic hierarchy, and I was firmly at the bottom. The real heat that afternoon was not coming from the grill, but from the card table. I was sitting across from my older cousin, Marcus. Marcus is 35, loud, arrogant, and had recently launched his own boutique private security firm. My family treated him like the next great entrepreneur, completely ignoring the fact that his company was barely keeping its head above water and that he was drowning in debt to keep up appearances. We were in the middle of a tense hand when Marcus slammed his cards down onto the glass patio table with entirely too much force. A wave of his craft beer sloshed over the rim of his plastic cup, splashing directly onto my brand new limited edition sneakers. He did not apologize. He did not even flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his patio chair, flashing a gold-capped smile that irritated me to my core. "My bad, Zariah," he chuckled, though his eyes told an entirely different story. It was a deliberate act of disrespect. "You know you can probably get those cleaned with your employee discount at whatever delivery call center you are working at these days. It really is a shame the military chewed you up and spit you out so fast. But hey, if you ever need a real job, my security firm is hiring receptionists. I pay minimum wage, but it beats logging delivery routes for shipping trucks." I slowly took a paper napkin and dabbed at the wet suede of my shoes. I did not raise my voice. I had been trained to remain completely detached in high-pressure situations, and a backyard barbecue with my arrogant cousin was absolute child's play compared to what I had survived. "I am doing just fine, Marcus," I said smoothly. "But thanks for the offer. I sincerely hope your little mall cop business takes off before your creditors come knocking." Marcus scowled, his fragile ego instantly bruised, ready to snap back. But before he could, a high-pitched, syrupy voice cut through the tension. "Oh, please, Zariah, do not be bitter, just because Marcus is building an empire while you are still struggling to find your footing." It was Chloe, my 32-year-old sister-in-law. Chloe is a wealthy white woman who married my older brother David, the undisputed golden child of the Washington family. David is the vice president of a tech company, and to my parents, he and Chloe represent the ultimate trophy. My parents worshipped Chloe, treating her background and her generational wealth as a badge of honor that elevated our family status. Chloe stepped up to the table, daintily wiping her fingers with a wet wipe, as if the very air around our game was too gritty for her refined sensibilities. She looked at me with that familiar condescending tilt of her head. Her eyes scanned my casual outfit, eventually lingering on my natural hair, which I wore in thick, beautiful, unbothered locks. "You know, Zariah." Chloe sighed, using her perfectly manicured hand to gesture vaguely at my head. "You really should let me book you an appointment with my stylist. She works absolute miracles with difficult hair. You need to learn how to present yourself like a proper woman. Just look at the way this family raised David to be so polished. The military just made you look so rough and unapproachable. It is no wonder you are struggling to find a decent corporate job. You simply lack the right aesthetics. I stared at her, absorbing the casual insult she delivered with a sickeningly sweet smile. Chloe loved to weaponize her privilege while pretending she was just trying to be a helpful sister. Before I could even formulate a response that would not ruin the barbecue, my mother, Loretta, hurried over to our table. Loretta put a protective hand on Chloe's arm, nodding in fervent agreement with her daughter-in-law. Chloe is exactly right. Zariah, my mother, scolded, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper, so the other guests would not hear her losing her temper. Look at you. David invited several very important corporate clients today, and you are sitting here picking fights with Marcus and looking utterly unkempt. Why can you not just be pleasant for one single afternoon? You are embarrassing us in front of David's VIP guests. We have a reputation to maintain in this community, and your attitude is a complete liability. I glanced across the manicured lawn. My brother David was standing by the outdoor bar, laughing loudly and pouring expensive bourbon for a group of men in crisp linen shirts. Among them was a man named Elias. He was an older white gentleman, broad-shouldered with a rigid posture and sharp, scanning eyes. I recognized his bearing immediately. He was a retired Navy SEAL now working high-level executive protection for the tech elite. David was clearly trying incredibly hard to impress him, laughing at all his jokes, probably hoping to secure a lucrative corporate security contract for his struggling tech firm. I turned my attention back to the table. My own mother was looking at me with thinly veiled disappointment, readily siding with the sister-in-law who constantly disrespected our culture, all for the sake of keeping up appearances. My father, Calvin, stood a few feet away, flipping burgers on his massive grill, purposely ignoring the situation because he hated any confrontation that did not involve him giving orders. Marcus, feeling completely emboldened by my mother and Chloe backing him up, leaned across the glass table again, his chest puffed out, his ego inflating by the second. Seriously, though, Zariah Marcus sneered, folding his muscular arms. What exactly did you even do during your little failed stint in the army? Did you ever even see any real combat? Or did you just sit at a desk answering phones and filing paperwork while the real men did the heavy lifting? I bet you did not even touch a weapon out there. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the warm Atlanta breeze wash over my face. I looked at Marcus, then at Chloe's smug face, and finally at my mother's disapproving glare. None of them had any idea who I truly was. They thought I was a failure because I did not wear designer suits or drive a leased luxury car. They did not know that after I left the military, I did not become a delivery driver. I founded Aegis Global, a private security and military logistics corporation that I built from the ground up, now valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. I looked back at Marcus and offered a calm, chilling smile that did not reach my eyes. I only engaged in hand-to-hand combat, I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely flat. Knives were purely optional. Marcus erupted into a loud, mocking laugh, slapping his knee in exaggerated amusement. Oh, listen to her. Hand-to-hand. Knives optional. He looked around to make sure the other guests were watching his performance. What a tough girl we have here. Let me guess, with an attitude like that, what did the guys in your unit call you? Princess. Sweetheart. I did not blink. I held his gaze, stripping away the polite family facade, letting a fraction of the cold, lethal authority I commanded in my real life bleed into my eyes. Hades, I said. The word hung in the humid air, quiet but devastating. Marcus stopped laughing, his brow furrowing in confusion at my serious tone. But the reaction I was waiting for did not come from my arrogant cousin. Less than 20 feet away, at the outdoor bar, Elias, the retired Navy SEAL, had been listening to our conversation. The moment the word Hades left my lips, the heavy crystal bourbon glass slipped from his hand. It hit the stone patio with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces. The loud noise stopped the music and the chatter instantly. Every head turned toward the bar. Elias was staring dead at me, his face completely drained of color. His hands were shaking visibly against his sides. He pushed past David, ignoring the spilled liquor soaking into his expensive shoes, and took 2 steps toward me. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly what the callsign Hades meant in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the world. My family was about to find out that the woman they had been insulting all afternoon was not a delivery driver. She was a god of the underworld. The sharp sound of the shattering crystal bourbon glass cut through the heavy summer air like a gunshot. The steady thump of the classic rhythm and blues playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly seemed muffled as a heavy, stifling silence descended over the patio. Everyone froze. Marcus paused with his mocking grin half-formed on his face. Chloe stopped wiping her delicate hands. My mother Loretta snapped her head toward the outdoor bar, her eyes wide with absolute shock at the sudden disruption of her perfectly curated event. Elias, the retired Navy SEAL, did not even look down at the expensive liquor soaking into his suede loafers. His broad shoulders were rigid. His weathered face, a map of combat scars and sun damage, had drained of all color. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the lethal click. He pushed past my brother David, completely ignoring the confused murmurs of the other affluent guests gathered by the pool. He walked toward my table with slow, deliberate steps. His eyes were locked onto mine, and I could see the visible tremor in his hands. This was a man who had faced down death in the most hostile environments on Earth yet. Standing in my parents' pristine backyard, he was trembling. "Are you—" He started, his voice hoarse and cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again, leaning slightly across the glass table. "Are you the one who pulled Bravo team out of the Syrian cauldron in 2018? The question hung in the humid Atlanta air. For a fleeting second, the smell of smoked brisket and sweet hickory sauce vanished, completely replaced by the phantom scent of burning diesel and cordite. I remembered the blistering heat of that Syrian night, the deafening roar of the extraction chopper, the dead weight of the wounded operators we hauled over the concrete blast walls. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. I did not nod. I did not confirm or deny. I simply looked at him with the cold, dead, steady gaze that had earned me my call sign. Before Elias could process my silence, David rushed over. My older brother looked frantic, his tailored linen suit wrinkling as he aggressively grabbed Elias by the shoulder. David had spent months trying to court this man, hoping to secure a massive corporate contract for his own struggling tech company. The absolute last thing David wanted was for his prized VIP guest to interact with the family embarrassment. "Elias, my friend David said, forcing a loud, booming laugh that sounded painfully unnatural. "I think you have had a bit too much of the good bourbon. The southern heat out here is getting to your head. Let us get you a glass of ice water and sit you down in the shade." Elias tried to shake off David's grip, his eyes still desperately searching my face for confirmation. "David, you do not understand," he stammered. "If this woman is Hades, then she is an absolute legend. She is the reason 3 of my brothers in arms are still breathing today. The entire special operations community knows the stories about what her unit did." David's fake smile tightened into a grimace of pure irritation. He pulled Elias back harder, positioning his body entirely between the retired SEAL and my chair. "Elias, you are definitely confused," David said, his voice dripping with that familiar patronizing tone he always used when discussing my existence. "This is just my little sister Zariah. She is not a legend. She is not a hero. She just works at a delivery dispatch center taking phone calls all day. You are mistaking her for someone else. Someone actually important." Chloe stepped right up beside her husband, her white privilege wrapping around her like a protective shield. She placed a manicured hand on Elias's other arm, offering him a look of deep, exaggerated pity. "It is perfectly fine, Elias," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We all know Zariah likes to tell tall tales to make herself sound more exciting. The military was very hard on her, and she struggled to adjust when they sent her packing. We just humor her little delusions of grandeur. She is harmless, really. Just a bit rough around the edges and severely lacking in ambition." I watched the exchange, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water. The audacity of Chloe standing in my parents' backyard explaining my military record to a decorated veteran was staggering but entirely predictable. She had always viewed my service as some gritty blue-collar job, completely beneath the polished upper-crust lifestyle she and David pretended to maintain. She loved to use these gatherings to assert her dominance, using polite words to deliver vicious microaggressions. Elias looked at Chloe and David as if they had both completely lost their minds. He looked back at me, his eyes darting between my relaxed posture and the dismissive, arrogant faces of my family members. He was a highly trained observer. He could read the room perfectly. He saw the way Marcus was smirking, the way my mother was glaring at me from across the lawn, and the way David was actively trying to humiliate me just to save face. Elias opened his mouth to speak again to defend my honor and set my arrogant brother straight. I could see the righteous indignation building in his broad chest, but I did not need his defense. I needed him out of the line of fire. I caught his eye and gave him a single sharp, microscopic shake of my head. It was a tactical command, a direct order from a superior to stand down immediately. Elias closed his mouth instantly. The military discipline kicked in, overriding his desire to argue. He recognized a superior commanding the battlefield, and he knew better than to interfere with an operation currently in progress. He took a slow step backward, his posture shifting from defensive to highly respectful. "I sincerely apologize," he said quietly, addressing me directly, while completely ignoring David and Chloe. "I must have been mistaken. Enjoy your afternoon, ma'am." He turned and walked back to the bar, leaving David looking incredibly pleased with himself. David adjusted his linen jacket, throwing a triumphant look at our mother. "See, Mom?" David announced loudly, ensuring the surrounding relatives could hear him clearly. "I handled it. I am not going to let her ruin this barbecue with her ridiculous attention-seeking behavior." Loretta marched over her expensive high heels, sinking slightly into the pristine grass. Her face was a mask of absolute fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "Zariah, what is wrong with you?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but laced with pure venom. "Your brother works day and night to build his network to bring high-class, respectable people into this home. He is trying to elevate the standing of this family in the community, and you sit here playing stupid games and making his guests incredibly uncomfortable." "I am simply sitting here, Mother," I replied calmly, setting my glass down on the table. "Marcus is the one spilling cheap beer on my shoes." "Do not you dare blame Marcus," Loretta snapped. "Marcus is actually building a real business. He is making something of himself. You are a 32-year-old woman who still answers phones for a living. You have no husband, no assets, and no shame. You are a walking liability to the Washington name." Marcus leaned back in his patio chair, his fragile ego completely restored by my mother's fierce defense. He crossed his arms over his chest, offering me a wide, victorious smirk. "You heard Aunt Loretta," he mocked. "You need to stay in your lane, Zariah. You almost had that old man convinced you were some kind of super soldier. That is pathetic even for you. Maybe you should stick to delivering packages. At least that way you are actually useful to society." I felt the familiar adrenaline pumping through my veins, cold and sharp. The pressure in the backyard was building exactly as I wanted it to. I had spent years letting them underestimate me, letting them build their entire identities on the false premise that they were superior. Every insult, every microaggression, every condescending remark from Chloe was just fuel for the fire I was about to ignite. I did not say a single word. I just stared at Marcus, letting the silence stretch out, making him squirm slightly under the weight of my empty gaze. "Enough." The booming voice of my father Calvin cut through the tension like a dull machete. He abandoned his post at the massive custom-built grill and marched toward our table. Calvin was a man who demanded absolute obedience. He was obsessed with being the patriarch, the ultimate authority figure of the Washington clan. He hated when the spotlight shifted away from his control, and he clearly hated that I was the center of the current drama. He pushed past David and stood directly over me, his shadow falling across the glass table. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard and unforgiving. He did not look at me like a daughter. He looked at me like a problem that needed to be eradicated immediately. "We are done playing these childish games, Zariah." Calvin barked, his voice echoing across the patio, causing several guests to turn their heads and stare. I am sick and tired of the constant disruptions. We have important business to handle today, and I will not let your attitude derail this family's progress any longer. He reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive tailored vest. He pulled out a thick folded legal document marked with bright red sign, "Here tabs." The paper was slightly crumpled at the edges, showing that he had been carrying it around all day, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. He did not hand it to me respectfully. He raised his arm and threw the heavy stack of papers directly at my chest. The document hit me with a dull thud and slid down onto the glass table resting right next to my water glass. "Drop this embarrassing nonsense," Calvin commanded, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You have wasted enough of our time today. Read the contract and sign your name right now." I picked up the crumpled document from the glass table, smoothing out the edges with slow, deliberate movements. I did not need to read the fine print to know exactly what it was. The bold legal header across the top declared it a quitclaim deed. It was the official paperwork transferring ownership of a historic Victorian mansion located in the heart of downtown Charleston. That beautiful, sprawling house was the only piece of property my grandmother had explicitly left to me, bypassing my parents entirely when she passed away 5 years ago. My grandmother was the only person in the Washington family who saw through my parents' obsession with status. She knew exactly what my father would do with that property if he ever got his hands on the title. She left it to me as a sanctuary, a place where I could always find peace away from the crushing expectations of Atlanta high society. My father stood over me, his chest heaving with impatient anger. He looked down at me, not with the affection of a parent, but with the cold calculation of a man trying to liquidate a stubborn asset. "Marcus needs capital to expand his security operations." Calvin barked, his voice laced with absolute authority. "He has a massive contract lined up, but he needs a $500,000 line of credit to secure the tactical equipment and the additional manpower. That old house in Charleston is sitting completely empty. You are going to sign the deed over to him today so he can leverage the property for the business loan." My mother Loretta stepped up beside him, nodding in fierce agreement. She crossed her arms, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together. "We took you in when you came back from the military with absolutely nothing," she scolded, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "We let you live under our roof while you figured out your little delivery job. This family supports each other, Zariah. We pool our resources for the greater good. Marcus is on the verge of building true generational wealth for the Washington name. It is time for you to stop being selfish and finally pay us back for everything we have done for you." I looked from the deed to my father and then to Marcus. Marcus was practically vibrating with entitled greed, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he waited for me to hand over a multi-million-dollar estate to fund his crumbling facade of a business. The absolute audacity of their demand was staggering. They wanted me to surrender my only inheritance to finance the delusions of a man who could not even properly manage a backyard barbecue, let alone a high-stakes corporate security firm. I knew exactly why Marcus needed that $500,000, and it had nothing to do with securing tactical equipment. He had blown his initial startup funding on a luxury sports car, expensive bottle service at local clubs, and a leased office space he could not afford just to project the image of a successful CEO. I slid the paperwork back across the table, pushing it away from me. My voice remained perfectly steady, carrying no emotion whatsoever. "No." The word hung in the heavy summer air, sharp and final. My father blinked clearly, not processing the rejection. "Excuse me," Calvin growled, taking a threatening step closer. "I am not signing over my property," I stated, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "Not today, not ever. That house belongs to me. If Marcus has mismanaged his business finances to the point of needing a bailout, he needs to find his funding somewhere else. I am not financing his incompetence." The patio went deathly quiet. Refusing Calvin Washington in front of family was considered an unforgivable sin, but refusing him in front of his precious corporate guests was a declaration of war. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. He opened his mouth to unleash his fury, but before he could even utter a single syllable, the dynamic of the argument shifted entirely. Chloe, my privileged sister-in-law, let out a dramatic wounded gasp. She pressed both of her delicate hands to her chest, her eyes widening in exaggerated horror, as if I had just physically struck her. Within seconds, her lower lip began to tremble. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. Tears welled up in her eyes, perfectly timed and expertly executed, spilling over her lashes and streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks. It was the classic weaponization of fragility designed to instantly cast her as the innocent victim and me as the aggressive, unhinged threat. How can you be so incredibly cold? Zariah? Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking loudly enough to draw the attention of every single guest remaining in the yard. She brought a tissue to her face, dabbing at her eyes while making sure everyone could see her distress. David has been under so much financial pressure lately trying to keep everything afloat for this family. We are all so stressed trying to support each other and build a legacy we can be proud of. And you just sit there with that smug, emotionless look on your face, holding onto an empty house you do not even use. You are literally tearing this family apart with your intense selfishness. David immediately dropped his drink and rushed to his wife, wrapping a fiercely protective arm around her shoulders. He glared at me as if I were a monster who had just kicked a puppy. Chloe buried her face in his chest, letting out loud theatrical sobs that shook her entire frame. David stroked her hair, whispering soothing words to her while shooting daggers at me. "Can you not see what you are doing to her?" David yelled, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn. "She is sensitive, Zariah. She cares about this family, and you are deliberately trying to hurt her. You have always been jealous of Chloe, and now you are letting your bitter attitude destroy our peace. You need to apologize to her right now and sign that paper." The sight of Chloe crying acted like a lit match dropped into a powder keg. It gave my family the exact excuse they needed to completely lose their minds. They were no longer just angry about a rejected business loan. They were now valiantly defending a weeping, fragile woman from my supposed cruelty. The narrative had shifted entirely in their favor, allowing them to channel all their resentment into self-righteous fury. My mother rushed to Chloe's other side, rubbing her back and glaring at me with pure hatred. "You are a disgrace to this family, Zariah." Loretta spat, her voice trembling with rage. "We give you everything and you repay us by making your sister-in-law cry in our own backyard. You have absolutely no heart. The military stripped away whatever humanity you had left." I sat perfectly still, watching the circus unfold around me. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my posture. I simply watched Chloe peek out from David's chest, her tear-filled eyes locking onto mine for a fraction of a second. Hidden beneath her tragic performance, I saw the unmistakable glint of triumph. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had successfully manipulated the entire patio, turning my refusal to surrender my property into a personal attack against her emotional well-being. Marcus saw his opening. His eyes wild with rage and wounded pride, he realized that with the family distracted by Chloe's tears, he had the perfect opportunity to assert his dominance. He wanted to be the hero who put the disrespectful outcast back in her place. He slammed both of his hands down on the patio table, causing the remaining glasses to rattle violently. He leaned his entire body weight forward, his muscles tensing as he prepared to strike. "You disrespectful, ungrateful brat!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking with uncontrollable fury. "You do not get to come into this house, insult my business, make Chloe cry, and disrespect your father. I am going to teach you how to speak to this family." He lunged across the glass table, his arm pulling back. He raised his hand high into the air, aiming a violent, open-handed slap directly at my face, intending to publicly humiliate me and physically force my submission. He brought his hand down with all his body weight behind it, aiming a violent, open-handed slap directly at my cheek. He fully intended to strike me hard enough to knock me out of my chair and force my submission in front of the entire party. I did not even blink. In less than a fraction of a second, years of brutal combat training and muscle memory took completely over. Before anyone on that patio could even process what was happening, I shifted my weight, slipping cleanly under his massive swinging arm. I grabbed his wrist, twisted my hips, and used his own reckless momentum entirely against him. The world seemed to blur in a fast pan of motion. I swept his legs out from under him with a precision strike to his calf. The impact was immediate and devastating. Marcus hit the perfectly manicured grass with a heavy, sickening thud that knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to register the shock of the sudden fall, I was on top of him. I drove my knee down, planting it firmly between his shoulder blades and pinning him flat against the earth. I grabbed his right arm, the same arm he had just tried to strike me with, and wrenched it sharply up behind his back. I locked his wrist at a terrible, unnatural angle. A sharp, dry pop cracked through the humid air like a snapping tree branch. It was the undeniable sound of his shoulder popping cleanly out of its socket. A beat of absolute silence passed before Marcus realized what had just happened to his body. Then he let out a guttural, agonizing scream that ripped through the backyard, tearing the polite country club atmosphere entirely to shreds. He thrashed weakly against the grass, his face buried in the dirt, begging me to let him go, crying out about his arm. He sounded like a terrified child. I did not move an inch. I kept the pressure perfectly consistent, applying just enough leverage to ensure he could not move, but not quite enough to permanently tear his rotator cuff. I looked down at him feeling absolutely nothing. No guilt, no hesitation, no fear. He wanted to play the tough guy. He wanted to use physical violence to intimidate a woman, and he had just received a masterclass in why you never attack an unknown target. He was a man who played at being security, pretending to be a protector, while I was a woman who had spent years surviving in actual war zones. The patio erupted into absolute chaos. Guests shrieked and scrambled backward, knocking over expensive wicker chairs and spilling plates of catered food. The pristine image of the Washington family barbecue shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Chloe was screaming hysterically now, no longer faking her delicate tears, but genuinely terrified by the sudden explosive violence. My father, Calvin, stood completely paralyzed by the grill, his jaw hanging slack, the barbecue tongs slipping from his hand and clattering onto the stone pavers. He had spent his entire life bullying people with words and his bank account. He had zero concept of how to handle actual physical dominance. It was my mother, Loretta, who snapped out of the shock first. Seeing her precious, successful nephew pinned to the ground crying in the dirt sent her completely over the edge. Her carefully constructed socialite facade vanished, replacing the elegant hostess with a woman consumed by blind rage. She let out a high-pitched, furious shriek. "You animal!" she screamed, her face contorting with a rage I had never seen directed at anyone but me. She lunged forward, her expensive silk dress whipping around her legs, her long manicured acrylic nails extended like claws. She was aiming right for my face, fully intending to scratch my eyes out and physically rip me away from Marcus. I did not flinch. I did not even look up from Marcus, who was still weeping into the grass. I knew exactly how long it would take her to reach me, and I had already calculated the precise minimum force required to deflect her without breaking her wrist. I was entirely prepared to put my own mother on the ground right next to my cousin. But I did not have to touch her. Before Loretta could take 3 steps, Elias, the retired Navy SEAL, moved with a speed that defied his age. He intercepted her path completely, inserting his broad, muscular frame between me and my charging mother. He did not touch her gently. He threw his rigid arm out, creating a solid human barricade that stopped Loretta dead in her tracks. With his other hand, Elias reached into his tailored suit jacket and whipped out a matte black tactical stun gun. The electrical current sparked to life, arcing brightly between the metal prongs with a loud, aggressive crackle that cut right through Marcus' screaming and the panicked murmurs of the guests. "Step back right now!" Elias roared, his commanding voice projecting across the lawn with absolute military authority. "Step the hell back, all of you!" My mother stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the sparking weapon in pure terror. Calvin finally jolted to life, rushing over to pull his wife away from the angry security contractor. Elias kept the stun gun raised, his sharp eyes sweeping over my family with a look of absolute disgust. He stood his ground, forming a protective shield around me, while I kept Marcus immobilized on the grass. You arrogant fools! Elias barked, not breaking his defensive stance. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. You are standing here treating her like some helpless punching bag. You think you can just put your hands on her because she is family. You are messing with an unpinned grenade. David took a hesitant step forward, holding his hands up defensively. Elias, you need to calm down, David pleaded, his voice shaking. She is just a dispatcher. She went crazy. She attacked Marcus unprovoked. You are protecting a violent psychopath. Elias let out a harsh, humorless laugh, the stun gun still crackling in his grip. A dispatcher, he repeated, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. You people are blind. If she wanted to, your nephew would already be dead, and none of you would have even seen it happen. I am not stepping in to protect her from you. I am stepping in to protect you from her. Get back off, you idiots. The reality of Elias' words crashed over the patio. This highly respected security expert, the very man David had spent all afternoon trying to impress, was now standing guard over the family outcast, holding a weapon against the hosts of the party. He had essentially just confirmed that I was not the weak, defenseless failure they had always believed me to be. The humiliation for my parents was absolute and complete. They were being publicly chastised in their own backyard in front of the very corporate elite they worshipped. David, realizing that his entire networking event was ruined, his sister-in-law was traumatized, and his prized VIP guest had turned violently against him, decided to play his final card. He could not fight Elias, and he certainly could not fight me. So he reverted to the only weapon the Washington family truly understood and respected: wealth, privilege, and the legal system. David pulled his expensive smartphone from his pocket, his fingers trembling with suppressed rage. His face was a mask of furious entitlement. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a cold, vindictive promise to destroy my life completely. He believed that because I had no money and no status, I would be entirely at the mercy of the police. He believed he held all the power. You are completely done, Zariah, David sneered, jabbing his finger at the screen as he rapidly dialed 3 numbers. I am calling 911 right now. You just assaulted Marcus unprovoked in front of 50 witnesses. You are a violent menace to society. I am going to have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs and throw you in a county jail cell for aggravated assault and battery. Let us see how tough you are when you are locked up in a concrete box and begging us for bail money. You're finished, Zariah. I'll have the police put you in jail for assault and intentional infliction of injury. David had his phone pressed tightly against his ear, screaming into the receiver. You are completely done, Zariah. I am calling 911 right now. I am going to have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs for aggravated assault. I released the pressure on Marcus's twisted wrist. He collapsed fully into the manicured grass, clutching his dislocated shoulder and sobbing loudly like a terrified child. I stood up slowly. The humid Atlanta summer air clung to my skin, but my heart rate was as steady as if I had just taken a casual morning stroll. I looked down at my hands, flexing my fingers once to release the residual tension, then casually brushed a few stray blades of grass from my dark linen trousers. David was still yelling, holding the phone like a weapon, painting a picture of an unhinged, violent woman attacking an innocent businessman. I turned my gaze to him. I did not interrupt his frantic performance. I simply watched him panic. Go ahead and call them, David, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick, tense air of the patio. My tone was so devoid of anxiety or fear that it actually made him falter. He paused, the phone still pressed to his sweating face. Tell the emergency dispatcher exactly what happened here today. Tell them your sister defended herself against an unprovoked physical assault. Tell them Elias here, a decorated military veteran, witnessed the entire thing and had to draw a tactical weapon just to stop our mother from joining the attack. I am absolutely sure the Atlanta Police Department will find the security footage from your perimeter cameras incredibly enlightening. David's eyes darted upward, instantly searching the eaves of the house. He saw the sleek black lenses of the security cameras pointing directly at the patio. His face went a shade paler. He knew Marcus threw the first hand. He knew the cameras captured his wife faking her tears. and his cousin lunging across the table. He knew he had absolutely no legal ground to stand on. He slowly lowered the phone, ending the call before the dispatcher could even transfer him to an officer. "That is exactly what I thought," I murmured. I shifted my focus back down to Marcus. He was rolling on his side in the dirt, his face smeared with sweat and tears. The arrogant gold-capped smile was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of absolute misery and defeat. This was the man who had spent the last hour mocking my military service, calling me a failed dispatcher, and reducing my entire existence to a punchline for his corporate friends. Now he was weeping on the ground, completely neutralized in less than a second. "Before you start worrying about pressing charges, Marcus," I said, stepping slightly closer, so his tear-filled eyes had to look up at me, "you should probably start worrying about your company, the one you were just bragging about so loudly." Marcus groaned, spitting a blade of grass from his mouth. "You broke my arm, you psycho!" He wheezed, his chest heaving. "I dislocated it," I corrected sharply. "If I wanted to break it, you would have heard a much louder snap, and you would be in surgery right now. Now focus, your new private security firm. The one you desperately need a $500,000 loan from my father to get off the ground. You secured a commercial lease for your grand headquarters recently, did not you?" Marcus blinked, his eyes narrowing in confused pain. The agony in his shoulder was momentarily eclipsed by a sudden creeping sense of dread. He stopped writhing in the grass and stared at me. "What are you talking about, my father?" Calvin demanded. Stepping forward, though, he maintained a very safe distance from Elias and his crackling stun gun. "Leave his business out of this, Zariah. You have done enough damage to this family today." I ignored Calvin completely, keeping my eyes locked on my cousin. Number 45, Lexington Avenue. I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable so the words would echo across the quiet yard. Suite 800. The top floor with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the private executive elevator access. Rent is roughly $20,000 a month plus a massive security deposit that you barely scrape together by maxing out every single one of your personal credit cards. Am I right, Marcus? The color entirely drained from Marcus's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw dropped open. He had kept that specific location a closely guarded secret, wanting to surprise the family with a grand reveal once the ink on his father's loan was completely dry. He had not told a single soul the address. "How do you know that address?" Marcus stammered, his voice shaking with a brand new kind of fear. "How do you know about the deposit?" Instead of answering his question, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The sleek black device felt heavy and powerful in my palm. The patio was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned cocktail glasses. I unlocked the screen, tapped a contact, and hit the speakerphone button. I held the phone up high so the ringing echoed across the silent yard for everyone to hear. On the second ring, a crisp, highly professional voice answered the line. "Good afternoon, Ms. Washington. This is Richard Sterling. How can I assist you today?" Marcus gasped audibly. He recognized that voice instantly. Richard Sterling was the high-end commercial property manager who handled the most exclusive corporate real estate in the entire city. Marcus had spent weeks kissing up to Richard, taking him to expensive lunches just to get a foot in the door for that office space. "Good afternoon, Richard," I said, my voice smooth and commanding, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I need you to pull up the commercial lease agreement for a company called Apex Secure Solutions. The primary tenant listed on the paperwork is Marcus Washington." "Right away, ma'am," Richard replied, the sound of rapid keyboard clicking coming clearly through the speaker. "Yes, I have the file right here. Suite 800 at the Lexington property. The lease is pending final signature tomorrow morning, but the security deposit has already been processed and cleared." Marcus tried to push himself up off the grass, his good arm trembling violently under his weight. "Zariah, what are you doing?" he hissed, genuine panic lacing every single word. "Hang up the phone right now, please." I did not even glance in his direction. "Richard, cancel that contract immediately," I ordered. "Void the lease agreement in its entirety. The tenant's personal conduct and extreme lack of emotional control do not meet our corporate security standards." I will not have an unstable, volatile liability occupying a premium suite in that building. Understood, Ms. Washington, Richard replied without a single second of hesitation or question. I will void the contract right now and notify the legal team to draft the official termination notice. And Richard, I added, my eyes finally dropping back down to Marcus's horrified face. Confiscate the security deposit in full. Cite Section 4, Paragraph B of the preliminary agreement regarding moral turpitude and breach of conduct prior to move-in. He physically assaulted an individual today. We will keep the deposit for administrative damages and breach of trust. Consider it done, Richard said efficiently. The funds will be absorbed into the holding account immediately. Is there anything else you require, ma'am? That will be all. Thank you, Richard. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that follows a devastating explosion leveling a building. Marcus stared at me, his mouth hanging open, completely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. In less than 3 minutes, I had not only physically incapacitated him, but I had entirely dismantled the business he had built his entire arrogant persona upon. He had lost his office space, he had lost his prestigious headquarters, and he had just lost the massive deposit that he had gone into crippling financial debt to secure. He was completely financially and socially ruined. Chloe covered her mouth with her delicate hands, her fake tears drying up instantly as the real financial gravity of the situation registered in her materialistic brain. David looked like he was going to be physically sick, taking a step back and running a hand down his face. Even Elias, the hardened military veteran who had defended me, raised a single impressed eyebrow in silent appreciation of the ruthless tactical strike. My mother, Loretta, finally broke the dead silence. She took a hesitant, trembling step forward, her previous rage now entirely replaced by a profound, stuttering confusion. Her perfect socialite mask had shattered completely. She looked at me as if I were a total stranger, an alien who had somehow invaded her perfectly controlled daughter's body. Zaria Loretta stammered, her voice weak and shaking uncontrollably. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my pocket where my phone rested. What did you just do? Who was that man on the phone? What gives you the right to call a high-level property manager and cancel your cousin's commercial contract? You are just a dispatcher. I looked at my mother and then at my father, taking in their utter bewilderment. They had spent their entire lives judging books by their covers, worshipping wealth, and bowing to people they perceived to have power. They had treated me like dirt because I chose not to play their superficial games. It was finally time to show them who held the real power in this family. I squared my shoulders, looking down at my parents with the cold, absolute authority of a billionaire CEO who controlled industries they could not even fathom. I have the right. Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that carried across the entire patio, hitting them with the force of a physical blow. Because I have the absolute right of the person who owns the building. The sheer impossibility of my statement hung in the humid air, paralyzing the entire patio. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was Marcus letting out low, pathetic groans from the grass, where Elias kept a watchful eye over him. David stared at me, his tailored linen suit suddenly looking less like the uniform of a successful tech CEO and more like a wrinkled straitjacket. The color rushed back into his face, turning his skin a mottled, furious red. "You are completely out of your mind," David barked, letting out a harsh barking laugh that sounded dangerously close to hysteria. He looked around at the remaining guests, spreading his arms wide, as if inviting them to share in the absolute absurdity of my claim. "Did you hear her? She is totally delusional. A building. You own a high-rise commercial property on Lexington Avenue. You are a dispatcher, Zariah. You answer phones in a windowless room for $15 an hour. You could not even afford the monthly maintenance fees on a commercial elevator, let alone the mortgage on the property." I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not need to defend my reality against his fragile illusions. I stood perfectly still on the manicured grass, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The imaginary camera of the moment seemed to detach, tracking in a slow, tight circle around the patio, capturing the shifting dynamics of the Washington family. It circled past my mother Loretta, whose mouth was still parted in shock, past my father Calvin, whose fierce glare was slowly transitioning into a gaze of profound uncertainty, and finally settling on David and Chloe. The slow, circular perspective would highlight the exact moment the arrogant light in David's eyes began to flicker and die. I reached down and casually brushed a microscopic speck of dust from my dark linen trousers, projecting an aura of absolute unbothered calm. Then I stepped toward the glass patio table where the disputed property deed still rested. I unclasped my leather handbag, reached inside, and pulled out a sleek, heavy silver USB drive. I tossed it onto the glass. The metal hit the surface with a sharp, definitive clink that made Chloe physically jump. Marcus was just a convenient loudmouth idiot today. I stated, my voice smooth, cold, and carrying the deadly precision of a sniper's bullet. His little security startup is a joke. He wanted the house to fund his leased sports cars and his bottle service habits. But Marcus does not have the intellect to draft a quitclaim deed structured to transfer a historic property into a blind holding trust. You drafted that paperwork, David. Marcus was just the distraction the aggressive attack dog meant to bully me into signing. But you are the one who desperately needed the capital. David's jaw snapped shut. The mocking laughter died in his throat instantly. A single bead of sweat materialized at his hairline, tracking slowly down his temple. I do not know what kind of paranoid fantasy you are spinning, David said, his voice losing its booming resonance and dropping a full octave. But I am not going to stand here and listen to $5 million. I interrupted, cutting him off with the surgical application of the truth. That is the exact amount of operating capital currently missing from your tech company's primary accounts. The slow, invisible pan of the camera captured David stumbling backward. His heel caught the edge of a stone paver and he nearly lost his balance. He looked as though I had just driven a combat knife directly through his ribs. I did not stop. I advanced a single step, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his. You have always been incredibly arrogant, David, but you are remarkably sloppy when it comes to covering your digital footprints. Your board of directors ordered a comprehensive background financial audit last week because your quarterly projections were not adding up. I know this because my actual company, the cybersecurity firm I built from the ground up after I left the military, was quietly contracted to run the penetration testing and trace the missing capital. We found every single red cent. That is a lie, David choked out, but his voice was barely a whisper. He looked frantically toward our father. Dad, she is making this up. She is trying to ruin me. You routed the money through 3 separate offshore shell companies. I continued, mercilessly stripping away his golden child armor layer by layer. And you did not steal it to save the business. You siphoned $5 million of investor capital to fund a fraudulent lifestyle because your wife's wealthy parents finally cut her off, and you were too weak to tell her no. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, her manicured hands flying to her throat. Do not look so shocked, Chloe, I said, turning my dead steady gaze toward her. We traced the expenditures directly to your personal accounts. $100,000 disguised as fake consulting fees to pay for your exclusive country club memberships and your designer wardrobe. $200,000 wired to a luxury real estate broker for that summer rental in the Hamptons you bragged about on social media. The matching luxury SUVs, the daily spa treatments, the private chef. You two have been treating corporate investor funds like a personal piggy bank to maintain an illusion of upper-crust superiority that you cannot actually afford. Calvin stepped forward, his heavy, expensive shoes crunching against the grass. He looked at David, his face entirely drained of its usual patriarchal fury, replaced now by a dawning horrific realization. David, Calvin demanded, his voice dangerously low. Tell me she is lying. Tell me right now that you did not steal from your own investors. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was physically trembling, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw oxygen into his panicked lungs. He looked at the silver USB drive resting on the glass table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The audit begins officially on Monday morning, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. You are completely out of time. You knew the auditors would trace the missing $5 million immediately. You needed a massive, untraceable cash injection to quietly replace the stolen funds before Monday. So you targeted my property. A historic debt-free Victorian mansion in downtown Charleston is easily worth enough to collateralize a quiet bridge loan. You engineered this entire family barbecue. You riled up Marcus. You provoked the argument. You thought you could use the collective pressure of this toxic family to force the worthless outcast sister to sign away her inheritance. You thought you could plug the $5 million hole in your sinking ship and continue playing the untouchable golden boy. The patio descended into a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. The slow, circular pan of the scene would show the absolute devastation of the Washington family hierarchy. Marcus was still on the ground, clutching his ruined shoulder, his business dreams entirely shattered. Calvin and Loretta stood side by side, staring at their eldest son. The son they had worshipped. The son they had constantly compared me to. The son they had believed was building generational wealth. He was not a genius. He was a common thief and embezzler facing decades in federal prison. Loretta raised a shaking hand to her chest, her heavy gold jewelry rattling. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My God, David, tell me this is not true. Tell me you did not steal." David could not look at his mother. He squeezed his eyes shut, his face contorting in shame and absolute terror. The silence was his confession. The spell broke with a sudden frantic burst of movement. Chloe, realizing that her entire world of luxury, status, and privilege was evaporating into thin air, completely lost whatever remained of her manufactured composure. She was no longer playing the fragile, weeping victim. The sheer terror of losing her wealth and facing criminal complicity turned her vicious. She lunged toward her designer purse, snatching her phone with shaking, frantic fingers. Her face was red, her eyes wild with a feral panic. "This is slander!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the yard. "You are making all of this up to destroy us because you are a jealous, bitter loser. You have no proof. That USB drive is a fake. I am calling my family's legal team right now. We are going to sue you for everything you have. You are going to die in litigation, Zariah. I will make sure my lawyers bury you so deep you never see the light of day. You're making false accusations. I'll call my family's lawyer and you'll die in the lawsuit." Chloe jabbed her manicured finger against the glass screen of her phone, her breathing ragged and loud in the silent yard. She hit the speakerphone icon and thrust the device out in front of her chest, holding it like a shield. She wanted every single person remaining on the patio to hear my impending doom. She wanted my parents to witness her family's wealth swooping in to eradicate the outcast who dared to threaten their perfect suburban illusion. The phone rang once, twice, then a deep, impeccably polished voice filled the humid Atlanta air. "Richard Reynolds speaking. How can I assist you?" Chloe let out a breathless, dramatic sigh of relief, her shoulders dropping as she heard the familiar voice of her family's most ruthless attack dog. "Richard, it is Chloe. I am dealing with an absolute nightmare right now, and I need you to initiate a massive legal strike immediately." Reynolds let out a smooth, practiced chuckle, the kind of laugh a man gives when he charges $1,000 an hour and loves his job. "Calm down, Chloe. Take a breath and tell me who we are destroying today." Chloe shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. Her eyes were manic, completely wild with the desperate need to reclaim her superiority. She pointed her free hand right at my face. "Her name is Zariah Washington. She is my husband's estranged sister. She is a completely unhinged, violent psychopath who just physically assaulted a guest at our home. And now she is trying to extort David with fabricated financial documents. I want her entirely ruined, Richard. I want cease and desist orders filed in the next hour. I want massive defamation suits drawn up. I want you to drag her into litigation so deep and so expensive that she is left completely bankrupt and begging on the street." The Washington family collectively exhaled. the tension leaving their bodies as they heard Chloe unleash her ultimate weapon. My mother Loretta straightened her posture, a smug, satisfied smile creeping back onto her face. My father Calvin crossed his arms, looking at me with cold, disappointed judgment, firmly believing that the natural order of things was about to be restored. David wiped the sweat from his pale forehead, letting out a shaky breath of relief. They all truly believed that this high-powered corporate lawyer was about to save their golden child from federal prison. A disgruntled family member attempting low-level extortion? Reynolds mused, his voice dripping with absolute elitist boredom. How incredibly tedious. Do not worry about a single thing, Chloe. We handle these pathetic shakedown attempts all the time. I will assign 3 of my most aggressive senior partners to the case immediately. We will freeze her assets, seize her bank accounts, and bury her in so much aggressive legal paperwork she will not be able to afford a public defender. She picked the wrong family to mess with. She is as good as dead. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood tall and completely still on the manicured grass, allowing a slow, relaxed smile to finally touch my lips. I casually brushed a speck of dust from the sleeve of my linen shirt, moving with the easy, unhurried grace of a predator who already had its prey securely in its jaws. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward Chloe. She instinctively recoiled, but I was not looking at her. I directed my voice straight down toward the speakerphone resting in her trembling palm. "Mr. Reynolds, is it?" I asked, my voice cutting through the patio air with lethal, icy clarity. The line went quiet for a fraction of a second. "Who is speaking?" Reynolds demanded, his tone sharp and irritated at the sudden interruption. "I am the woman you just promised to bankrupt and destroy," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "My name is Zariah Washington, but since you are speaking in a professional capacity, you might know me better by my corporate title. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Global." The silence that erupted from the speakerphone was absolute. It was not just a pause in the conversation. It was a sudden, terrifying void. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling the ground completely crumble beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. Aegis Global was not just a cybersecurity firm. It was a monolithic digital defense contractor that protected the servers, databanks, and private communications of the most powerful corporations on the eastern seaboard, and Richard Reynolds' law firm, a firm that handled highly sensitive multinational mergers, corporate acquisitions, and the dirty secrets of billionaires, was entirely dependent on Aegis Global's proprietary encryption software to keep their firm alive. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Chloe frowned, staring down at her phone in confusion. "Richard," she snapped impatiently. "Did you hear her? She is delusional. Tell her what you are going to do to her." Madam President," Reynolds finally stammered. The smooth, arrogant confidence had been entirely stripped from his voice. He sounded like he was physically choking on his own tie. His voice trembled, vibrating with a raw, unfiltered panic that made Chloe's eyes widen in sheer horror. "Please accept my deepest apologies." Reynolds stuttered the words, tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate, frantic rush. "I had absolutely no idea Madame Chloe was going up against you. I was not informed of the target's identity. Aegis Global is our primary defense contractor. Our entire law firm is completely dependent on your security infrastructure and your daily digital oversight. We rely entirely on your good graces to operate." The blood instantly drained from Chloe's face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Her perfectly contoured features went slack as her brain struggled to process the reality of what her own lawyer was saying. "Richard, what are you talking about?" Chloe shrieked, panic fully taking over her voice. "You work for my family. You are supposed to destroy her." "I am doing no such thing," Reynolds barked, his tone flipping from groveling apology to outright terror-fueled rage. "Are you completely insane, Chloe? Aegis Global handles the encrypted servers for our top-tier clients. If Madam President pulls our security contract, our firm is completely exposed to international data breaches by tomorrow morning. We would be ruined. The entire firm would be liquidated within a week." He did not even pause to take a breath before speaking directly to me again, his voice shaking with absolute submission. Madam President, I assure you my firm will have absolutely zero involvement in this matter. We will not draft a single document. We will not file a single motion. As of this exact second, I am formally terminating Chloe Sterling as a client of this firm. We represent you and we support Aegis Global entirely. Please, I beg you, do not sever our contract over this misunderstanding. I will take your cooperation into consideration, Mr. Reynolds, I replied coolly. Have a pleasant evening. I am hanging up now. Reynolds babbled quickly. Have a wonderful night, Madam President. I am so sorry. The line went dead, with a sharp click. Chloe stared down at the dark screen of her phone, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Her ultimate weapon, her family's endless wealth and legal power, had just bowed down to me and completely abandoned her. Her fingers went entirely numb. The expensive smartphone slipped from her grasp, dropping onto the patio stones with a harsh crack, shattering the screen into a spiderweb of broken glass. David stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a patio chair. He sank down into the seat looking like a man who was fully preparing to face a firing squad. His sister, the woman he had belittled, mocked, and painted as a pathetic failure, was the president of Aegis Global. She was the architect of his audit. She was the executioner of his stolen wealth. He had absolutely nowhere left to run. My father, Calvin, looked like he was having a genuine medical emergency. He gripped the edge of the outdoor bar, his knuckles turning stark white. He stared at me, his eyes wide and terrified, finally seeing me not as his disappointing daughter, but as a corporate titan who could crush his entire legacy without even breaking a sweat. My mother, Loretta, stood frozen beside him, her hands clamped over her mouth, unable to utter a single word of defense for her golden child. The total collapse of the Washington family was a masterpiece of silent devastation. They were trapped on their own patio, stripped of their money, their pride, and their false superiority. But I was not quite finished. Before anyone could break the heavy, suffocating silence, a low, rhythmic thrumming sound began to echo in the distance. The noise grew louder and heavier with every passing second, vibrating deep within the chest cavity. The leaves on the massive oak trees surrounding the backyard began to violently shake and thrash. The wind picked up rapidly, whipping the expensive tablecloths into the air and sending the remaining crystal glasses shattering against the patio stones. The heavy, aggressive roar of military-grade helicopter rotors tore the peaceful night sky completely to shreds. The Washington family looked up in sheer terror, shielding their faces from the sudden, violent downdraft. A massive black tactical transport helicopter crested the tree line, hovering directly above my parents' pristine backyard. The sheer force of the rotors flattened the manicured grass and sent Marcus's expensive patio furniture skidding across the lawn. Suddenly, a blinding, hyper-intense searchlight clicked on from the belly of the aircraft. The thick beam of brilliant white light shot straight down, illuminating the backyard with the intensity of a midday sun. The spotlight swept across the terrified faces of my family, pinning David, Chloe, Calvin, and Loretta in a circle of inescapable glaring light. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, the violent wind whipping my hair around my face. I looked up into the blinding light, feeling the familiar, comforting roar of my true element. My extraction team had arrived. The blinding white light cut through the humid night air, turning the backyard into a stark, high-contrast theater stage. The deafening thud of the military-grade rotors drowned out every single scream and gasp that had previously filled the patio. The sheer physical pressure of the downdraft acted like a giant invisible hand, forcing the Washington family to the ground. I watched them completely lose their minds under the overwhelming display of force. Calvin and Loretta dropped to their knees, shielding their heads with their arms, as if they were anticipating a missile strike. Chloe abandoned her shattered phone and crawled under the heavy teak dining table, sobbing uncontrollably, while David covered his ears, his face pressed hard into the wet grass. Marcus stopped his pathetic groaning and just lay paralyzed in the dirt, too terrified to even breathe. I did not blink. I did not move a single inch. I let the intense wind whip the dark linen fabric of my clothes, standing tall and completely relaxed in the exact center of the blinding beam. The camera of the moment tilted upward, capturing me, standing like a monolith against the storm, while the people who had mocked me cowered at my feet. I casually reached up and brushed a stray piece of debris from my shoulder. This was the world I had built in the shadows. This was the undeniable power they had so foolishly convinced themselves I lacked. The heavy wrought iron gates at the very back of the estate did not just open, they were violently breached. The heavy metal locks snapped under a synchronized impact, swinging wide to reveal 6 figures stepping out of the darkness and directly into the perimeter of the harsh light. They were not local police officers responding to David's petty phone call. They certainly were not the cheap rent-a-cops Marcus hired to stand around his leased sports cars. They moved with perfect lethal synchronization. Each of them wore tailored black tactical suits equipped with discreet communications gear, and they carried themselves with the cold, calculating posture of elite Tier 1 operatives. They moved across the lawn, completely ignoring the chaotic environment. They bypassed the shattered crystal glasses, the overturned chairs, and the terrified affluent guests who were now cowering in the decorative bushes. They stepped right over Marcus's trembling body, as if he were nothing more than a discarded piece of landscaping trash. They marched straight toward me, their boots hitting the grass in perfect unison, and stopped exactly 3 feet away. Without a single word of hesitation, the 6 imposing figures snapped their heels together and bowed deeply, bending rigidly at a 90-degree angle in a display of absolute, unwavering respect. The lead operative, a man named Vance, whom I had personally recruited out of federal counterintelligence, straightened up. He did not look at my parents. He did not spare a single glance for David or Chloe. His eyes were locked respectfully on mine, waiting for my command. Madam President Vance projected his voice expertly, cutting through the fading roar of the helicopter hovering high above the tree line. The forensic audit is fully complete. Our accounting divisions have finalized the trace on the missing $5 million. We have forwarded the encrypted data package directly to the federal authorities as per your standing orders. The FBI arrest warrant for David Washington for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny has just been officially signed by a federal judge. The agents are currently en route to this location. The words hit the patio with the destructive force of a kinetic strike. David let out a sound that was half gasp and half whimper, scrambling backward on his hands and knees until his back hit the brick wall of the outdoor kitchen. He looked exactly like a trapped rat, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. Calvin slowly pulled himself up using the edge of a patio chair, his knees visibly shaking under his weight. The intense wind from the rotors had died down slightly, but the blinding light remained fixed on us. My father stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes, his reality entirely fractured. Madam President Calvin whispered the words, tasting like poison on his tongue. "What is he talking about, Zariah? You answer phones. You are a low-level dispatcher. You live in a tiny apartment." I looked at my father and felt a deep, satisfying coldness wash through my veins. I let the silence stretch, allowing the absolute weight of his ignorance to crush him. "I am a dispatcher, Dad," I replied, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. "I dispatch elite tactical units, global cybersecurity teams, and high-level crisis management operatives across 3 continents. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Global. We are the largest military contracting and security logistics corporation on the East Coast. My company is currently valued at $800 million. I took a slow step forward, my eyes sweeping over my mother, who was still kneeling on the grass. "I did not come home to live quietly under your roof because I was a failure who needed your charity. I came home because I was building a shadow empire right under your arrogant noses. I needed a quiet place to run global operations while remaining completely anonymous. And more importantly, I needed to know exactly who my family truly was before I decided whether to share my world with you. You all made your choices very clear." My mother Loretta let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if her heart had simply stopped beating. Her mind was frantically trying to process the magnitude of her colossal mistake. All those years she had spent parading David and Marcus around, treating them like royalty, while forcing me to eat in the kitchen and actively hiding me from her high society friends. All the vicious microaggressions, all the cruel comments about my lack of ambition. It had all been a massive cosmic joke. She had been treating an $800 million corporate titan like a servant. The sheer embarrassment of knowing her country club friends would eventually find out the truth was already tearing her apart. Calvin staggered backward, his face completely gray. His hands grasped at the empty air as the crushing reality of his miscalculation broke his patriarchal spirit entirely. He had worshipped wealth and status his entire life, and he had just spent the last 5 years actively alienating the wealthiest and most powerful person he would ever meet. He looked over at David, his supposed golden child, the man who was supposed to carry the Washington legacy. David was now nothing more than a confirmed felon, waiting to be hauled away in handcuffs, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. But I was not quite finished. I had one final box to check. I turned my attention back to David, who was sweating profusely against the brick wall. His eyes were darting frantically around the yard, looking for a legal loophole or a physical escape route that simply did not exist. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He cringed, pressing himself harder into the masonry, his breathing coming in short, terrified gasps. "David," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational as if we were discussing the weather. "Did you ever wonder how your struggling little tech startup managed to secure that massive Series C funding round last year? Did you really think those ruthless venture capitalists suddenly believed in your completely mediocre vision and your flawed business model?" David stared at me, a brand new layer of absolute dread washing over his face. He shook his head slowly, unable to speak. I smiled at him. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator revealing its teeth to a cornered prey. "An Aegis Global's private investment fund," I stated, watching his soul completely leave his body, "is the largest primary shareholder behind your tech company, David. I am your boss's boss." The invisible camera lens detached from my steady gaze and immediately locked onto Chloe, tracking her every erratic, panicked movement. She stumbled backward, her designer heels sinking deep into the softened earth and ruining the expensive leather. Her breathing was no longer just panicked, it was a ragged, desperate wheeze. The impenetrable bubble of privilege and generational wealth that had shielded her for her entire life was violently bursting right in front of her eyes. She looked at the 6 heavily armed tactical operatives standing at absolute attention in our backyard. She looked up at the sleek black aircraft hovering above, casting its blinding searchlight down upon us. And finally she looked at me, standing with the casual authority of a billionaire who held her entire future in the palm of my hand. She realized instantly that the money was gone. The summer homes, the luxury cars, the daily spa treatments, and the endless shopping sprees were all evaporating into the thick evening air. And much worse, she was staring down the barrel of a severe federal indictment. Panic, a feral, primitive survival instinct, entirely overrode whatever manufactured affection she had for her husband. Chloe let out a guttural, sobbing shriek. She dropped to her knees right there in the ruined grass, uncaring that she was destroying her pristine silk dress. She frantically grabbed at her left hand, her fingers clawing at the massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring David had bought her with stolen corporate funds. She ripped the platinum band over her knuckle, scraping her own skin in her desperate haste. She wound her arm back and hurled the heavy ring directly at David. The diamond struck him squarely in the chest, bouncing off his wrinkled linen jacket and falling uselessly into the dirt. "It was him!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the yard with ear-splitting intensity. "It was all him. He forced me to spend that money. He told me the company was doing brilliantly. I did not know anything about offshore accounts or embezzled funds. I am innocent. He is a liar and a thief, and he used me. I did not know anything." David let out a hollow, broken sound. He stared at the ring lying in the grass, and then at his wife, who was still kneeling in the dirt, weeping selfishly. The last remaining pillar of his perfect life, his beautiful, supportive trophy wife, had just sold him out to federal authorities without a single second of hesitation. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The tactical operatives subtly shifted their stances, ensuring the perimeter remained completely secure as I approached the groveling woman. I looked down at her tear-streaked face, her makeup running in dark, muddy lines down her cheeks. "You were right, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying easily over the ambient noise of the yard. "You told everyone earlier that the military made me rough. You said I was unrefined and aggressive. You are absolutely correct. The military stripped away my tolerance for polite society lies. It made me incredibly rough. But it also taught me exactly how to unmask pathetic, self-serving opportunists like you." I raised my hand and gestured to Vance. The tactical leader immediately reached up and tapped a small black device mounted on the chest rig of his tactical vest. A tiny red light blinked to life. Vance and his entire team were outfitted with high-definition body cameras recording audio and video directly to Aegis Global's secure cloud servers. "You just admitted on a federal tactical recording that you knew the money was stolen, Chloe," I stated, watching her eyes widen in fresh, unadulterated horror. "You just claimed he forced you to spend it, which means you were fully aware of its illicit origins while you were swiping those black cards at designer boutiques. You are on tape throwing your husband to the wolves to save your own skin. You have completely stripped away any chance of playing the naive, innocent housewife. You will not be able to use your family's connections, your privilege, or your tears to escape complicity today. The federal prosecutors are going to absolutely love this footage." Chloe slumped forward, planting her hands in the grass and sobbing hysterically. Her complete surrender was a pathetic sight, but it was entirely necessary. Before David could even attempt to process the absolute magnitude of his wife's betrayal, a figure stepped out from the deep shadows of the patio. It was Chief Thomas Miller, the head of the local police department. Marcus had proudly invited the chief to the barbecue earlier, bragging loudly to the family about his close personal connections with local law enforcement, in a desperate bid to make his new security company seem legitimate and powerful. Chief Miller had been quietly enjoying a plate of ribs by the outdoor kitchen, observing the entire spectacular collapse of the Washington family from a safe distance. David saw the familiar police uniform, and a desperate, frantic spark of hope ignited in his eyes. He thought his wealthy suburban connections were finally stepping in to save him from this nightmare. Thomas David gasped, pushing himself up from the brick wall. "Thomas, you have to stop this. She is crazy. You know me. You know my family. Arrest her. Get these paramilitary thugs off my property right now." Chief Miller did not look at me. He did not look at the tactical team. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on David. He reached around to the back of his duty belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the cuffs swinging open sounded incredibly loud in the sudden quiet of the yard. "I am sorry, David," the chief said, his voice heavy with grim professional duty. "But I just received a direct priority alert through the federal dispatch system. The FBI has officially flagged you as an extreme flight risk. They requested local law enforcement secure you on site until their federal agents arrive. I am taking you into custody for grand larceny and corporate embezzlement." Chief Miller stepped forward, grabbing David's arm and twisting it firmly behind his back. David did not even try to fight. The fight had been entirely drained out of him. He simply went limp, allowing the police chief to slap the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The golden boy, the brilliant tech CEO, the absolute pride and joy of Calvin and Loretta Washington, was now standing in his own backyard, wearing handcuffs, while his wife wept in the dirt, and his parents watched in complete paralyzed horror. My father, Calvin, staggered backward. He stumbled backward, his heavy frame crashing into a patio chair. He looked at his son in handcuffs and then at me, surrounded by elite tactical operatives. His entire worldview, the hierarchy he had ruthlessly enforced his whole life, was completely shattered. He could not speak. He could not breathe. He was a broken man watching his legacy burn to ash. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs locking into place seemed to act like a physical trigger for Marcus. He had been lying in the grass, clutching his dislocated shoulder, watching his powerful, wealthy cousin be reduced to a common criminal in a matter of minutes. The arrogance that had fueled his entire existence had evaporated. The realization that he had just picked a physical fight with a billionaire defense contractor finally penetrated his thick skull. He forgot about his agonizing shoulder. He awkwardly pushed himself up onto his knees, dragging his body across the flattened grass. He moved toward me, leaving a trail of disturbed earth behind him. He stopped just short of my boots, looking up at me, with eyes so wide and terrified they looked like they belonged to a stranger. Zariah Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Zariah, please. Please, you have to stop this. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything I said today. I was just trying to impress David. He put me up to it. Please do not take my company away. I put everything into that security firm. I will do anything. I will apologize to everyone. I will scrub your floors. Just please tell your property manager to give me my office back. Spare my company, Zaria, please. I am begging you." The violent downdraft from the tactical transport helicopter slowly began to ease as the massive aircraft shifted its hover perimeter, allowing the federal agents on the ground to take over the scene. The deafening roar faded into a heavy mechanical thrum, but the stark, blinding spotlight remained pinned directly on us. The raw, chaotic energy of the yard felt as though it was being captured by a shaky handheld camera, zooming in tight on Marcus's tear-streaked, dirt-smeared face. He was crawling toward me, dragging his knees across the ruined turf, his dislocated shoulder hanging at a grotesque angle. He did not look like the arrogant corporate shark who had spent the entire afternoon mocking my military service and calling me a glorified receptionist. He looked like a pathetic, broken child. "Please, Zariah." Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a desperate, wet sob. "We are family. We share the same blood. You cannot do this to your own cousin." "I was stupid today. Okay, I was an idiot. But you know me. We grew up together. You cannot let them take everything I have worked for. Just call your property manager and tell him it was a misunderstanding. I will give you whatever you want, a percentage of the business, free security for life. Just spare my company. It is all I have." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, just a cold, clinical disgust. The imaginary camera held tight on his desperate eyes, capturing the exact moment I let out a slow, humorless breath. "Blood does not give you a free pass to put your hands on me, Marcus," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Family does not give you permission to leverage my life to fund your pathetic vanity project. You did not care about blood when you lunged across that table. You did not care about family when you wrapped your fingers around my throat and tried to choke me into submission. You only care about blood now because you are bleeding out." I reached into the pocket of my dark linen trousers and pulled out my smartphone. The sleek black device felt cold and heavy in my palm. Marcus watched my hand, his eyes widening with a brand new kind of terror as I unlocked the screen. "What are you doing?" he wheezed frantically, trying to push himself closer to my boots. "Zariah, please put the phone away. I am begging you on my knees. I will be your servant. I will never speak to you disrespectfully again. Just put the phone down." I ignored his groveling completely. I bypassed my standard contacts and opened a secure encrypted directory, tapping a number that bypassed all public switchboards and connected directly to the executive offices of the State Security Commission. As a primary strategic partner and the largest military contractor on the Eastern Seaboard, Aegis Global held direct oversight privileges with state licensing boards. The line rang exactly once before a crisp professional voice answered. "Commissioner's office. Director Hayes speaking." "Director Hayes, this is Zariah Washington," I said, projecting my voice clearly over the ambient noise of the yard. "I am calling in my capacity as president of Aegis Global." The tension on the other end of the line evaporated instantly, replaced by absolute deference. "Madam President Hayes," responded, his tone sharply respectful. "It is an honor. How can the Commission assist Aegis Global tonight?" "I need you to pull the primary operating license for a newly registered private security firm operating under the name Apex Secure Solutions." I ordered, my eyes locked dead onto Marcus's horrified face. The primary license holder is Marcus Washington. I am officially reporting him for aggravated assault and extreme violent misconduct. He physically attacked me unprovoked 30 minutes ago. He is completely unstable and poses an immediate violent threat to the public. Marcus let out a strangled, horrific gasp. He reached out with his good arm, his fingers clawing desperately at the air inches from my leg, but Vance, the lead tactical operative, instantly stepped forward, driving the heavy heel of his combat boot down onto the grass, just millimeters from Marcus's hand. The unspoken threat was perfectly clear: move another inch and lose the hand. Marcus froze, entirely paralyzed by fear. Understood, Madam President, Hayes replied without a single second of hesitation. Any individual who assaults the CEO of our primary defense partner is permanently unfit to hold a state security license. We take this matter incredibly seriously. I want his personal operating license revoked immediately. I continued, mercilessly stripping away the last remaining shreds of Marcus's ego. I want his corporate LLC permanently blacklisted from the state registry. He is never to be permitted to operate a security firm, carry a tactical firearm, or secure a commercial defense contract in this state ever again. Process the total revocation right now. Consider it done. Madame President Hayes confirmed, the sound of rapid keyboard typing echoing faintly through the speaker. The license for Apex Secure Solutions is effectively terminated as of this minute. His credentials have been flagged and permanently burned across all state and federal databases. The Commission will issue the formal termination notice by morning. Is there anything else you require? That will be all, Director. Thank you, I said, and ended the call, slipping the phone back into my pocket. The entire execution had taken exactly 30 seconds. In half a minute, I had not only destroyed his office lease, but I had entirely erased his company from existence. He had no business. He had no license. He had absolutely no future in the industry he had bragged about all afternoon. Marcus simply collapsed. He folded in on himself, pressing his forehead into the damp earth and letting out a long, agonizing wail of pure defeat. He wept into the grass, his broad shoulders shaking violently, mourning the death of his unearned arrogance. Just beyond Marcus, the red and blue flashing lights of federal vehicles pierced through the darkness as FBI agents swarmed the patio. They flanked Chief Miller, taking custody of David. My brother looked completely hollowed out, his tailored suit stained with sweat and dirt, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. They read him his rights, the heavy federal charges of grand larceny and wire fraud echoing over the quiet hum of the helicopter rotors. Chloe was nowhere to be seen, having likely scrambled into the house to hide from the feds and call her divorce attorneys. As they began to drag David away toward the waiting federal transport vehicles, the final pillar of the Washington family illusion completely shattered. My mother Loretta, who had stood paralyzed by the outdoor bar watching her entire carefully curated world burn to the ground, finally snapped. The elite country club mask she had worn for decades melted away entirely, leaving behind a desperate, terrified woman. She stumbled forward, her expensive heels tripping over the uneven grass. She bypassed her husband, who was still staring blankly at his handcuffed son. She bypassed the tactical operatives, ignoring their heavy weaponry. She ran directly toward me, her arms outstretched, tears streaming freely down her face, completely ruining her perfect makeup. Nia Loretta cried out, her voice shattering the tension with its raw desperation. I stiffened. Nia. It was a childhood nickname she had not used in over 15 years. A name she had abandoned the moment she realized I was not going to be the perfect, compliant socialite daughter she had demanded. Hearing it now falling from her lips in a moment of absolute panic felt like a ghost reaching out from the past. She reached me, dropping to her knees right beside Marcus, and desperately grabbed the sleeve of my linen shirt. Her grip was iron tight, her manicured nails digging into my arm. Nia, my beautiful girl. Loretta sobbed, looking up at me with wild, pleading eyes. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know any of this. I did not know David was stealing. I did not know you built this massive company. I was blind. We were all completely blind. I looked down at her hands gripping my sleeve. I did not pull away, but I did not offer her any comfort. I simply stood there, a monument of cold stone, watching the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small suddenly worship at my feet. "You have to stop them!" "Nia," Loretta begged, shaking my arm frantically as the FBI agents pushed David's head down and guided him into the back of a black armored SUV. "You have all this power. You have the military. You have the government. You are a billionaire. You can make this go away. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell the auditors to drop the case. Pay back the money he took. You have it. You can afford it. Please, Nia. He is your brother. He is my baby boy." Her voice dissolved into a hysterical shriek as the heavy door of the federal SUV slammed shut, trapping David inside. "You have to save him. Zariah," she wailed, clutching my arm with both hands, now treating me like a savior she had ignored her entire life. "Save your brother. Save this family's honor. We will be ruined. The scandal will be everywhere. Our friends will know. The country club will know. Please, my daughter, I am begging you. Use your power to fix this." The sheer audacity of her request hung in the air. The tragedy of Loretta Washington was not that her son was going to federal prison. The tragedy was that her friends were going to find out. She did not care about the crime. She only cared about the optics. She wanted me, the daughter she had deemed socially unfit and entirely worthless, to use my shadow empire to cover up the sins of her golden child. I stared down at her tear-stained face, the blinking red and blue lights of the FBI vehicles casting harsh shadows across her features. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and crushed grass. The helicopter spotlight still beat down upon us, framing the final desperate moments of a family that had destroyed itself from the inside out. I reached down and slowly peeled her fingers off my sleeve one by one. Her hands were trembling violently as I released her grip. She looked up at me, her expression suspended between hope and absolute terror, waiting for my decree. The patio was eerily silent now, save for the idling engines of the federal vehicles waiting to transport David to his new reality. Even Calvin had stepped forward, his pride broke in his eyes, mirroring his wife's desperate plea. They were both looking at me, expecting the loyal, compliant daughter to finally step up and shield them from the consequences of their own toxic creation. They actually believed that the title of family would magically erase decades of emotional neglect. I took a half step back, creating a clear physical boundary between my world and their collapsing empire. I looked at the flashing lights, at Marcus weeping in the dirt, and finally at my mother still kneeling on the grass. The Washington family honor was a myth built on stolen money and fragile egos, and I was the one who had finally turned the lights on. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried the absolute finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. The stark, harsh glare of the federal spotlights illuminated my mother's face in brutal, unsparing detail. I watched a heavy bead of sweat mix with her expensive foundation, tracking a muddy path down her cheek and dripping onto the collar of her ruined silk blouse. Her chest heaved with ragged, desperate breaths. Every carefully constructed layer of high society sophistication had been violently stripped away, leaving nothing but raw animal panic. I looked down at her, and my own face remained entirely devoid of emotion. The military and the boardroom had trained me to be a vault, locking away any trace of empathy when dealing with hostile threats. Right now, my parents were just another neutralized threat. Calvin Washington realized that his wife's hysterical weeping was achieving absolutely nothing. He staggered forward, pushing past the shattered crystal glasses and the overturned patio chairs. His face was a mask of terrified urgency. He stopped right beside Loretta, his chest rising and falling heavily as he looked around at the federal agents swarming his pristine backyard. He looked at the neighbors' houses where interior lights were rapidly flicking on, and silhouettes were pressing against the blinds to witness the spectacle. The carefully cultivated image of the perfect affluent family was publicly dying in real time. "Zariah, you have to listen to me!" Calvin demanded, his voice thick with a desperate, commanding tone that he no longer had the authority to use. "Look at what is happening here. Look at the people watching us right now. We are a prominent black family in a predominantly white neighborhood. We have spent decades building our reputation. We have spent our entire lives presenting a united front, proving that we belong here. You know exactly how the system works, Soraya. You know what they do to black men in the federal justice system. He took a step closer, lowering his voice into an urgent conspiratorial whisper, hoping to invoke a sense of shared cultural survival. You cannot hand your own brother over to them, Calvin pleaded, his hands trembling in the cool night air. Blood is thicker than water, Zaraya. We are blood. Black families must stick together when the world comes for us. If you let them take David tonight, you are letting them destroy everything we have built. You are destroying black excellence. You have the money. You have the power to make these federal agents disappear. Write a check, call your lawyers, protect your family's honor. Loretta eagerly grasped onto her husband's desperate narrative. Yes, Nia, she sobbed, reaching out and wrapping her fingers tightly around my wrist again. Please listen to your father. We have to protect our own. The media will devour us. They will drag the Washington name through the mud. You cannot let outsiders tear us apart. We are your family. Save your brother. Save our dignity. I stared at the two of them. The absolute, unmitigated hypocrisy of their words was staggering. I looked at my mother's manicured hands clutching my arm in a death grip, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure disgust. I violently jerked my arm back, breaking her grip with a sharp, decisive motion. Loretta gasped, stumbling backward into Calvin's chest. Do not ever dare to use the concept of black excellence as a shield to protect a common thief. I stated, my voice ringing out with a cold, lethal resonance that silenced the entire patio. You do not care about black excellence. You do not care about systemic injustice or the struggles of our community. You only care about the absolute fragile illusion of your own superiority. You care about country club memberships and leased luxury cars, and making sure your neighbors think you are untouchable. I took a slow, menacing step toward them, forcing Calvin to physically retreat under the sheer weight of my presence. You stand here right now preaching to me about family loyalty and protecting our own. I continued, my eyes locking onto Calvin's terrified gaze. Where was that fierce family loyalty when you let Chloe walk into this house and treat me like the help? Where was your pride in black excellence when you stood by and smiled while a privileged, opportunistic parasite openly humiliated your own daughter because she felt threatened by me? You tolerated her racism. You tolerated her entitlement. You rolled out the red carpet for a woman who viewed this entire family as nothing more than a bank account because she fit your pathetic, shallow aesthetic. Loretta covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled sob escaping her lips. Calvin looked physically ill, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the brutal truth of my words struck him. And do not speak to me about protecting the Washington legacy, I said, turning my attention back to my mother, who was visibly shrinking away from me. You were perfectly willing to let David steal from this family. You were willing to let him slowly drain the accounts and siphon off the hard-earned legacy that Grandma built with her own two hands just to fund his failing startup and Chloe's shopping sprees. You would have let him steal every last dime of our true heritage just because he wore tailored suits and fed your massive egos. You hate me because I did not conform to your shallow, superficial world. I refused to wear the ball gowns. I refused to play the quiet, submissive daughter. So you threw me away and worshipped a fraud. The heavy silence that followed my words was suddenly shattered by a violent commotion near the side gate. Chief Miller and two federal agents were actively marching David toward the driveway, where a line of black armored SUVs waited in the street. David was no longer walking with the smooth, confident stride of a tech CEO. He was stumbling, his expensive Italian loafers dragging through the mud, his shoulders pinned awkwardly backward by the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists. As they dragged him past the illuminated patio, David looked over at his parents. The stoic, noble facade he had tried to maintain completely vanished. The crushing reality of decades in a federal penitentiary finally broke his mind. He did not look at them with love or regret. He looked at them with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You did this!" David screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, feral shriek as he thrashed violently against the federal agents. You told me everything was fine. You told me nobody would ever check the offshore routing. You promised me you had it under control. Keep moving. Washington, one of the FBI agents, ordered, shoving David roughly forward toward the gate. But David refused to go quietly. He dug his heels into the grass, twisting his head back to spit venom at the people who had worshipped him his entire life. You are useless, he roared, his face contorted in a mask of absolute rage targeting his father. You are a weak, pathetic old man, Calvin. You sat there pretending to be a king, and you let her do this to me. You let her take everything. You failed me. Both of you failed me. Calvin flinched, as if he had been physically struck, taking a stumbling step backward. Loretta let out a piercing, devastated cry, covering her ears, to block out the hateful sounds of her golden child cursing her very existence. You ruined my life! David bellowed, his voice growing hoarse as the agents forcefully hauled him through the heavy iron gates. I hate you. I hate both of you. You are nothing. The heavy doors of the armored federal transport slammed shut, cutting off David's frantic screaming with a dull, resonant thud. The engines revved and the vehicles began to pull away, their red and blue lights painting the neighborhood houses in a chaotic strobe effect. I stood motionless on the grass, watching the taillights disappear down the manicured suburban street. The perfect model family that Calvin and Loretta had sacrificed everything to protect had just publicly, viciously torn itself apart right in front of the people they were so desperate to impress. I want absolutely nothing from you. I said my words, slicing through the heavy, humid air with the precision of a scalpel. The invisible camera of the moment seemed to slowly detach from my face and sink lower toward the ruined earth, capturing the scene from a grounded perspective. Thick gray smoke from the abandoned barbecue grill drifted lazily across the yard, mixing with the ambient moisture in the night air. The dense fog rolled over the shattered crystal glasses and trampled appetizers illuminated by the relentless rhythmic strobe of the red and blue lights from the remaining local police cruisers parked in the driveway. The flashing colors painted the smoky backyard in alternating washes of harsh crimson and cold sapphire, creating an atmosphere that felt like a surreal suburban war zone. Calvin Washington, the proud, arrogant patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist and a conditional heart, finally broke completely. His heavy knees buckled beneath him, hitting the wet dirt with a dull thud. He collapsed right next to Loretta, his expensive tailored slacks soaking up the mud. He looked up at me through the drifting barbecue smoke, his face completely devoid of the smug superiority he had worn like a second skin for my entire life. He was a dismantled man staring up at a daughter he did not recognize and a power he could not comprehend. What do you want, then? Zaria Calvin asked, his voice a hollow, desperate rasp. He raised his shaking hands, palms turned upward in a gesture of total surrender. You have destroyed your brother. You have destroyed Marcus. You have humiliated us in front of the entire neighborhood. What else is there left to take? Do you want money? Do you want the estate? Do you want your grandmother's house? I will sign it all over to you right now. Take the deed, take the accounts, take it all. Just tell your people to stand down and leave us alone. He was still trying to negotiate. Even now, completely broken and kneeling in the dirt, his mind could only operate in terms of transactions and assets. He genuinely believed that the pain of a lifetime of emotional abuse and systemic neglect could be bought out with a real estate transfer. I looked down at the man who shared my DNA and felt a profound, chilling sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The anger that had burned inside me for years, the desperate childhood need for his validation, had entirely evaporated. I slowly shook my head, the flashing blue lights catching the cold determination in my eyes. I do not need you to give me things I already own, Calvin. Calvin blinked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. What are you talking about? You offered me Grandma Martha's house, I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level. You offered me the only piece of real estate in this family that actually held any true sentimental value. But you cannot give it to me because you no longer hold the deed. 3 months ago when David's tech startup was hemorrhaging cash, and he desperately needed liquidity to cover up his initial embezzlement, you and Loretta quietly co-signed a massive high-interest leveraged loan against Grandma's property. You used the home of the woman who raised you as collateral to protect your golden boy's fraudulent image. Loretta let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Calvin in sheer panic, realizing that my corporate intelligence network had completely mapped out their darkest financial secrets. When the primary lender flagged the loan for imminent default due to David's missed payments, I continued watching Calvin's eyes widen in absolute horror. Aegis Global's real estate acquisition division stepped in. We purchased the debt outright through a proxy shell corporation. I paid off the encumbrance and transferred the deed completely legally. I own Grandma's house, Calvin. I have owned it for weeks. You are currently sitting here trying to bargain for your life with my property. Calvin slumped backward, his hands falling uselessly into his lap. The final realization that he was utterly powerless, that every hidden machination he had engineered had been tracked and countered, hit him with the force of a kinetic strike. "But I am not keeping the house as a trophy," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. The smoke swirled around my boots as I looked down at my parents. "I do not want a physical monument to a family that treated me like a disease. I just wanted you to look at the undeniable results of your toxic favoritism. You were willing to risk your own mother's legacy to protect a criminal just because he looked good in a suit." I paused, allowing the absolute weight of their failure to press down on them. Next month, I announced, my voice carrying a sharp, authoritative edge. The physical structure of Grandma's house will be completely demolished. The foundation will be cleared, and the land will be leveled. Loretta let out a broken wail. "No, Zariah, please. That is your grandmother's home. You cannot destroy it. It is our family history." "Your version of our family history is a lie, Loretta," I snapped back, my patience finally reaching its absolute limit. "And I am replacing your lie with a true legacy. In place of that house, Aegis Global is fully funding the construction of a state-of-the-art commercial facility. It will be named the Martha Washington Support Center for African American Female Veterans." I watched the words hit them, tracking the shock and incomprehension registering on their faces. It will be a fully staffed operational campus dedicated to providing elite mental health resources, advanced career placement in the defense sector, and transitional housing for Black women who actually served their country, I explained, detailing the vision I had spent the last year meticulously planning. Women who were told they were too rough or too aggressive by a society that demanded their protection but refused them their respect. Women exactly like me. I looked at Calvin, who was staring at the ground, his spirit entirely shattered. "That is what real excellence looks like, Calvin," I stated. "It is not about leasing European sports cars or buying country club memberships to impress people who secretly despise you. It is about utilizing absolute, uncompromising power to build something that actually matters. I am taking the Washington name, and I am permanently attaching it to the very military service you spent all afternoon mocking. Every single time you drive past that neighborhood for the rest of your life, you will have to look at a massive steel and glass monument dedicated to the daughter you threw away. You will have to look at my world." There was nothing left to say. The verbal and psychological dismantling was entirely complete. I had stripped them of their wealth, their golden child, their illusions of grandeur, and their generational leverage. I had laid bare the hollow, rotting core of their existence and replaced their legacy with my own. I took a deep, cleansing breath, the cool night air filling my lungs. I looked at Vance, the elite tactical operative standing rigidly at attention just a few feet away. I gave him a single sharp nod. Vance immediately raised a closed fist in the air. Fall, and the tactical leader barked his command, cutting through the smoky yard with harsh military precision. Instantly, the 6 heavily armed operatives moved in perfect lethal synchronization. They stepped away from the perimeter, bypassing the trembling, affluent guests who were still cowering behind the decorative hedges. They marched toward the center of the patio, the heavy tread of their combat boots hitting the brick pavers in absolute unison. They stopped, forming two perfectly straight parallel lines, creating a secure, rigid corridor that led directly from where I stood to the open wrought iron gates at the back of the estate. They snapped their rifles down against their tactical vests, standing at rigid attention, their faces completely impassive, hidden behind dark tactical visors. They had formed a flawless military honor guard right in the middle of Calvin Washington's ruined suburban sanctuary. I did not look back at my parents. I did not spare a single glance for Marcus, who was still whimpering softly in the mud, clutching his ruined shoulder. I simply turned and began to walk. I walked down the center of the tactical corridor, my boots echoing firmly against the brick patio. The smoke from the barbecue parted around me, the flashing police lights illuminating my path. I walked out of the yard, out of the suffocating toxic bubble I had been born into, and out of their lives forever. I stepped through the heavy iron gates and into the cool, dark night where a sleek armored SUV waited to take me back to the empire I had built in the shadows. I stepped forward and the world immediately parted for me. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, my dark boots striking the damp brick of the patio in perfect rhythm with the heavy, thudding hearts of the people cowering around me. The air was a thick, chaotic mixture of charred hickory meat, spilled expensive bourbon, and the sharp chemical bite of aviation fuel. Through the haze of the drifting smoke, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the yard in alternating washes of violence and cold reality. I did not look down. I kept my eyes fixed entirely straight ahead, walking down the precise center of the human corridor formed by my tactical operatives. The elite men of Aegis Global stood like imposing obsidian statues, their heavy rifles strapped tightly to their armored chests, their posture radiating absolute lethal readiness. They were my true family. They were the men and women I had bled with, fought beside, and built a shadow empire alongside. They protected me and I protected them. The contrast between their unwavering, silent loyalty and the treacherous, noisy betrayal of my own blood relatives was staggering. As I walked, the affluent guests of the Washington family barbecue scrambled frantically to get out of my way. These were the exact same people who had spent the entire afternoon sipping vintage scotch, whispering behind their manicured hands, judging my plain linen clothes, and looking at me with thinly veiled contempt. Now they were pressing their backs against the brick retaining walls, flattening themselves into the decorative hydrangeas, and tripping over their ruined designer shoes, just to avoid making eye contact with me. I watched wealthy venture capitalists and prominent local politicians shrink away, trembling like frightened children as I passed. The absolute illusion of their societal superiority had been violently shattered. They realized that their country club memberships and leased luxury cars offered absolutely no protection against true, unadulterated power. I approached the edge of the sprawling outdoor kitchen, where the imported marble countertops were now covered in shattered glass and overturned serving trays. The downdraft from the helicopter had destroyed the lavish spread Loretta had spent days agonizing over. It was a fitting metaphor for the destruction of her entire, carefully curated life. As I neared the final threshold of the patio, a solitary figure caught my eye. He was standing beside the ruined bar, completely separated from the panicked herd of affluent guests. It was Elias, the quiet, observant man with the faded anchor tattoo on his forearm, the veteran Navy SEAL who had recognized the subtle tactical awareness in my eyes hours before the helicopters ever breached the tree line. While the rest of the suburban elite were hyperventilating and hiding behind the landscaping, Elias stood completely exposed, his posture relaxed but incredibly alert. He did not look at me with fear. He did not look at me with the pathetic, groveling desperation that Marcus had shown, nor the shattered comprehension of my father. He looked at me with profound, absolute understanding. He knew exactly what it took to command the kind of men standing guard in this yard. He knew the heavy, invisible weight of the world I operated in. He knew the blood, the sacrifice, and the ruthless, calculating intelligence required to earn the Callsign Hades. I continued my steady pace, closing the distance between us. The heavy smoke swirled around Elias's boots, but he did not blink. As I drew level with him, the veteran operative subtly shifted his stance. He brought his feet together, the heels of his worn leather boots striking each other with a sharp, audible click that cut through the ambient noise of the yard. He straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back into a rigid posture of flawless military precision. Without uttering a single word, Elias brought his right hand up in a crisp, razor-sharp salute. His fingers were straight, his wrist perfectly aligned, the tip of his index finger resting precisely at the edge of his brow. He held the salute with unwavering intensity. It was the highest absolute form of respect a warrior could offer. It was not a gesture given to a billionaire defense contractor or a corporate CEO. It was a profound acknowledgement of a commanding officer. It was one soldier recognizing another across the vast, treacherous battlefield of life. The weight of that single silent gesture struck me harder than any of the screaming or crying that had preceded it. My own parents had spent 30 years looking at me and seeing nothing but a stubborn, flawed disappointment. They had demanded I change my hair, my clothes, my career, and my entire personality just to fit into their shallow, pathetic mold. They had withheld their love because I refused to be a compliant accessory to their suburban illusion. But this man, a stranger who had simply watched me observe a crowd for 2 hours, saw me exactly for who I was. He saw the fire, the discipline, and the lethal capability that my family had so arrogantly dismissed. He offered me the ultimate validation, rendering Calvin and Loretta's rejection completely and utterly meaningless. I did not stop walking, but I turned my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on his. I returned the gesture, not with a full salute, but with a slow, deliberate nod of my head. It was a silent, solemn communication between two people forged in the same fire. Message received. Respect acknowledged. I passed Elias, leaving the ruined patio behind, and stepping onto the manicured grass that led to the heavy wrought iron gates at the rear of the property. The operatives flanking my path fell in behind me as I passed, their heavy boots moving in perfect synchronization, forming a protective wedge at my back. Behind me, the chaotic symphony of the Washington family's destruction continued to play out. I could hear the distant wail of the police sirens fading into the night as they transported David to a federal holding cell where he would spend his first night as a ruined man. I could hear Marcus still whimpering pathetically in the dirt, mourning the total eradication of his fraudulent security company. And above it all, I could hear the ragged, breathless sobbing of my mother, leaning against a broken father, weeping for the death of her social status and the absolute loss of her golden child. They were tearing themselves apart, entirely consumed by the toxic environment they had spent decades building. I felt absolutely no obligation to look back. I had served my sentence in their house. I had paid my dues to their bloodline. I was finally completely free. I stepped through the wide open iron gates, crossing the physical boundary that separated their crumbling suburban illusion from the cold reality of the street. The air instantly felt cleaner, crisper, devoid of the suffocating scent of barbecue smoke and desperation. Idling silently at the curb was a massive, matte black armored SUV, its heavily tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights of the distant police cruisers. The vehicle was a rolling fortress designed to withstand armor-piercing rounds and explosive blasts. It was a tangible extension of the empire I had built. Vance stepped forward, moving with practiced, fluid efficiency. He reached out and pulled open the heavy ballistic door, holding it wide. The interior of the vehicle was cast in a soft amber glow, revealing plush leather seating and a bank of secure encrypted communication monitors. It was a mobile command center, quiet, secure, and perfectly controlled. Madam President Vance said, his voice a low, respectful murmur, cutting through the cool night air. We are clear for immediate departure. The airspace has been secured and the flight team is standing by for your extraction. I paused for a fraction of a second, resting my hand on the cold, reinforced steel of the doorframe. I did not turn around to look at the house. I did not need to see the sprawling brick mansion or the manicured lawns ever again. The Washington family was a closed chapter, a finalized audit, a mission that had been successfully completed and terminated. I stepped up into the dark, quiet sanctuary of the armored vehicle, settling into the deep leather seat. Take me home, Vance, I ordered, my voice calm and completely steady. Vance gave a sharp nod and slammed the heavy door shut. The thick ballistic glass sealed perfectly instantly, cutting off the sounds of the sirens, the sobbing, and the pathetic collapse of the arrogant family I had left behind. The powerful engine of the SUV rumbled to life, a deep, satisfying vibration that vibrated through the floorboards. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the shadows of the night, I looked forward into the darkness, completely at peace, returning to the massive shadow empire where I truly belonged. As the heavy tires of the armored SUV rolled onto the main road, the perspective shifted, pulling high up into the cool, starless sky. From above, the sprawling Washington estate no longer looked like a beacon of suburban elite success. It resembled a glowing, chaotic wound. The flashing police lights painted the shattered crystal, the trampled grass, and the ruined barbecue in harsh, unforgiving strokes. It was a fitting visual monument to a dynasty that had finally devoured itself from the inside out. The federal justice system moved with the exact ruthless efficiency I had orchestrated. Within months, David was convicted on multiple federal charges of grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud. He was handed a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, permanently stripped of his tailored suits, his corner office, and his unearned arrogance. Chloe, ever the calculating opportunist, filed for divorce the very morning after his arrest, desperately scrambling to shield her lavish lifestyle from the fallout. However, the federal auditors were relentlessly thorough. Suspected as a willing accomplice who directly benefited from the stolen funds, the courts immediately froze every single one of her accounts and seized her assets. She was unceremoniously evicted from her sprawling estate and forced to move into a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town, permanently separated from the designer labels and country club lunches that had defined her entire shallow existence. Marcus met a similarly brutal fate. With his operating licenses permanently revoked by the State Security Commission and his name blacklisted across all federal and commercial databases, his beloved security firm dissolved overnight. He declared total bankruptcy within a month. The arrogant bully who had pinned me to a table and called me a glorified receptionist now works the graveyard shift as an unarmed security guard at a dilapidated strip mall. He wears a poorly fitted polyester uniform, spending his cold nights entirely alone, haunted by the memory of the empire he lost in 30 seconds. But the most agonizing punishment was reserved for Calvin and Loretta. The scandal could not be contained behind their manicured hedges. When the truth inevitably leaked about them secretly using my grandmother's house as collateral to cover David's crimes, the social backlash was absolute and merciless. Their elite country club quietly revoked their membership. Their prominent church community, the very people they had spent decades desperately trying to impress, completely ostracized them. The Washingtons were suddenly toxic pariahs. They remained trapped in their massive, echoing brick mansion, wandering the empty halls as social ghosts. They had sacrificed their true daughter to worship their golden children, and in the end they lost absolutely everything. The dark, smoking ruins of the Washington estate slowly faded from my mind, dissolving seamlessly into the soft, warm glow of a crackling fireplace. The harsh crimson and sapphire police lights were replaced by the comforting golden illumination of my own living room. I sat in a deep leather armchair, the quiet, powerful hum of the city vibrating far below my penthouse windows. The flames from the hearth danced across the surface of the amber liquid in my hand. The spatial perspective of the room seemed to subtly shift, pulling back into the deep shadows while simultaneously zeroing in entirely on my face, capturing the slow, powerful smile that finally broke through my stoic facade. I rotated my wrist gently. The heavy crystal tumbler caught the firelight as the large spherical ice cube collided against the glass with a sharp, crisp clink. People always say that blood is thicker than water. They repeat it like a holy mantra, a protective spell designed to enforce blind loyalty and demand endless unconditional forgiveness. It is the ultimate excuse for toxic behavior, the perfect chain forged by those who have absolutely nothing else to offer but shared DNA. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage bourbon, letting the familiar heat ground me in the absolute victory of the present moment. But they always conveniently forget one fundamental truth about blood. Sometimes blood is exactly what attracts the sharks. For decades, my family treated me like expendable prey. They thought I was weak simply because I chose silence over their endless, shallow bragging. They looked at my military service and saw an embarrassing failure. They looked at my quiet demeanor and saw a convenient target. They truly believed I was just a glorified receptionist, a broken veteran answering phones at a basic desk, easily trampled upon to pave a glittering highway for their own fragile vanity. They desperately needed me to be small, so they could pretend to be large. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my silence. They did not know what happens to a person when they are stripped of their civilian identity and rebuilt in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the global theater. They did not comprehend the true weight of the Callsign Hades. When you survive actual hell, when you walk through the fire and emerge intact on the other side, you no longer fear the heat. You certainly no longer fear burning down the fake fragile worlds built by arrogant hypocrites. The fire cast long dancing shadows across the penthouse walls as I looked directly forward, my gaze piercing straight through the imaginary lens capturing this final execution. I raised the crystal glass, holding it up high in a silent, unwavering toast to the quiet ones, the outcasts, the family scapegoats who are secretly building their own formidable empires in the dark. So if someone ever mocks you at a family dinner or belittles your path simply because they lack the capacity to understand your vision, do not argue. Do not scream. Do not beg for their validation. Just smile. Let them enjoy their appetizers and their unearned pride, because the bill for arrogance is always the most expensive, and when it finally arrives, you will be the only one who can afford to pay it. The amber liquid caught the firelight one last time before the room plunged into absolute darkness.